Minister for Church Affairs to continue efforts to control Protestantism. 398. In 1936, a confessing church envoy protested to Hitler against the religious persecutions and human rights abuses. 397. Hundreds more pastors were arrested. 398. The church continued to resist, and by early 1937 Hitler abandoned his hope of uniting the Protestant churches. 397. Niemöller was arrested on the 1st of July 1937 and spent most of the next 7 years in Sachsenhausen concentration camp and Dachau. 399. Theological universities were closed, and pastors and theologians of other Protestant denominations were also arrested. 397. Prisoner barracks at Dachau concentration camp, where the Nazis established a dedicated clergy barracks for clerical opponents of their regime in 1940. 400. Persecution of the Catholic Church in Germany followed the Nazi takeover. 401. Hitler moved quickly to eliminate political Catholicism, rounding up functionaries of the Catholic Allied Bavarian People's Party and Catholic Center Party, which along with all other non-Nazi political parties ceased to exist by July. 402. The Reichskonkordat treaty with the Vatican was signed in 1933, amid continuing harassment of the Church in Germany. 297. The treaty required the regime to honor the independence of Catholic institutions and prohibited clergy from involvement in politics. 403. Hitler routinely disregarded the Concordat, closing all Catholic institutions whose functions were not strictly religious. 404. Clergy, nuns and lay leaders were targeted, with thousands of arrests over the ensuing years, often on trumped-up charges of currency smuggling or immorality. 405. Several Catholic leaders were targeted in the 1934 Night of the Long Knives assassinations. 406. 407. Most Catholic youth groups refused to dissolve themselves, and Hitler youth leader Baldur von Schirach encouraged members to attack Catholic boys in the streets. 408. Propaganda campaigns claimed the church was corrupt. Restrictions were placed on public meetings, and Catholic publications faced censorship. Catholic schools were required to reduce religious instruction, and crucifixes were removed from state buildings. 409. Pope Pius XI had the MIT Brennender Sorge, with burning concern, encyclical smuggled into Germany for Passion Sunday 1937 and read from every pulpit as it denounced the systematic hostility of regime toward the Church. 405. 410. In response, Goebbels renewed the regime's crackdown and propaganda against Catholics. Enrollment in denominational schools dropped sharply, and by 1939 all such schools were disbanded or converted to public facilities. 411. Later Catholic protests included the 22 March 1942 pastoral letter by the German bishops on the struggle against Christianity and the Church. 412. About 30% of Catholic priests were disciplined by police during the Nazi era. 413. 414. A vast security network spied on clergy, and priests were frequently denounced, arrested or sent to concentration camps. Many to the dedicated clergy barracks at Dachau. 415. In the areas of Poland annexed in 1939, the Nazis instigated a brutal suppression and systematic dismantling of the Catholic Church. 416. 417. Alfred Rosenberg, head of the Nazi Party Office of Foreign Affairs and Hitler's appointed cultural and educational leader for Nazi Germany, considered Catholicism to be among the Nazis' chief enemies. He planned the extermination of the foreign Christian faiths imported into Germany, and for the Bible and Christian cross to be replaced in all churches. cathedrals and chapels with copies of Mein Kampf and swastika. Other sects of Christianity were also targeted, with chief of the Nazi Party Chancellery Martin Bormann publicly proclaiming in 1941, National Socialism and Christianity are irreconcilable. 418. Culture. If the experience of Third Reich takes us anything, it is that a love of great music, great art and great literature does not provide people with any kind of moral or political immunization against violence, atrocity, or subservience to dictatorship. Richard J. Evans. The Coming of the Third Reich, 2003. The regime promoted the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, a national German ethnic community. The goal was to build a classless society based on racial purity and the perceived need to prepare for warfare, conquest and a struggle against Marxism. 419, 420. The German Labour Front founded the Kraftwerk KdF, Strength Through Joy, organization in 1933. As well as taking control of tens of thousands of privately run recreational clubs. It offered highly regimented holidays and entertainment such as cruises, vacation destinations and concerts. 421, 422. The Reichskulturkammer, Reich Chamber of Culture, was organized under the control of the Propaganda Ministry in September 1933. Sub-chambers were set up to control aspects of cultural life such as film, radio, newspapers, fine arts, music, theatre and literature. Members of these professions were required to join their respective organization. Jews and people considered politically unreliable were prevented from working in the arts, and many immigrated. Books and scripts had to be approved by the propaganda ministry prior to publication. Standards deteriorated as the regime sought to use cultural outlets exclusively as propaganda. 423. Radio became popular in Germany during the 1930s. Over 70% of households owned a receiver by 1939, more than any other country. By July 1933, radio station staffs were purged of leftists and others deemed undesirable. 424. Propaganda and speeches were typical radio fare immediately after the seizure of power. But as time went on, Goebbels insisted that more music be played so that listeners would not turn to foreign broadcasters for entertainment. 425. A Nazi book burning on the 10th of May 1933 inches Berlin, as books by Jewish and leftist authors are burned. 426. Censorship. Newspapers, like other media, were controlled by the state. The Reich Press Chamber shut down or bought newspapers and publishing houses. By 1939, over two-thirds of the newspapers and magazines were directly owned by the propaganda ministry. 427. The Nazi Party daily newspaper, the Volkische Beobachter, Ethnic Observer, was edited by Rosenberg, who also wrote The Myth of the 20th Century, a book of racial theories espousing Nordic superiority. 428. Goebbels controlled the wire services and insisted that all newspapers in Germany only publish content favorable to the regime. Under Goebbels, the propaganda ministry issued 24 directives every week on exactly what news should be published and what angles to use. The typical newspaper followed the directives closely, especially regarding what to omit. 429. Newspaper readership plummeted, partly because of the decreased quality of the content and partly because of the surge in popularity of radio. 430. Propaganda became less effective towards the end of the war, as people were able to obtain information outside of official channels. 431. Many authors left the country and some wrote material critical of the regime while in exile. Goebbels recommended that the remaining authors concentrate on books themed on Germanic myths and the concept half-blood and soil. By the end of 1933, over 1,000 books, most of them by Jewish authors or featuring Jewish characters, had been banned by the Nazi regime. 432 Nazi book burnings took place. 19 such events were held on the night of the 10th of May 1933. 426 Tens of thousands of books from dozens of figures, including Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Helen Keller, Alfred Kerr, Marcel Proust, Eric Maria Remarque, Upton Sinclair, Jacob Wasserman, H.G. Wells, and Emile Zola were publicly burned. Pacifist works and literature espousing liberal, democratic values were targeted for destruction, as well as any writings supporting the Weimar Republic or those written by Jewish authors. 433 Architecture and art. Plans for Berlin called forth Volkshalle, People's Hall, and a triumphal arch-togue built at either end of Wide Boulevard. Hitler took a personal interest in architecture and worked closely with Stadtarchitekts Paul Troost and Albert Speer to create public buildings in a neoclassical style based on Roman architecture. 434, 435 Speer constructed imposing structures such as the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg and a new Reich Chancellery building in Berlin. 436 Hitler's plans for a building. Berlin included a gigantic dome based on the Pantheon in Rome and a triumphal arch more than double the height of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Neither structure was built. 437 Hitler's belief that abstract, Dadaist, expressionist and modern art were decadent became the basis for policy. 438 Many art museum directors lost their posts in 1933 and were replaced by party members. 439 Some 6,500 modern works of art were removed from museums and replaced with work chosen by a Nazi jury. 440 Exhibitions of the rejected pieces, under titles such as Decadence in Art, were launched in 16 different cities by 1935. The Degenerate Art Exhibition, organized by Goebbels, ran in Munich from July to November 1937. The exhibition proved wildly popular, attracting over 2 million visitors. 441 Composer Richard Strauss was appointed president of the Rijksmusikkammer, Reich Music Chamber, on its founding in November 1933. 442 As was the case with other art forms, the Nazis ostracized musicians who were deemed racially unacceptable and for the most part disapproved of music that was too modern or atonal. 443 Jazz was considered especially inappropriate and foreign jazz musicians left the country or were expelled. 444 Hitler favored the music of Richard Wagner, especially pieces based on Germanic myths and heroic stories, and attended the Bayer Youth Festival each year from 1933 to 1942. 445 Film. Movies were popular in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, with admissions of over 1 billion people in 1942, 1943, and 1944. 446, 447. By 1934, German regulations restricting currency exports made it impossible for U.S. filmmakers to take their profits back to America, so the major film studios closed their German branches. Exports of German films plummeted, as their anti-Semitic content made them impossible to show in other countries. The two largest film companies, Universal Film AG and Tobias, were purchased by the Propaganda Ministry, which by 1939 was producing most German films. The productions were not always overtly propagandistic, but generally had a political subtext and followed party lines regarding themes and content. Scripts were pre-censored. 448. Leni Riefenstahl, behind cameraman, At the 1936 Summer Olympics, Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, 1935. Documenting the 1934 Nuremberg Rally and Olympia, 1938. Covering the 1936 Summer Olympics, pioneered techniques of camera movement and editing that influenced later films. New techniques such as telephoto lenses and cameras mounted on tracks were employed. Both films remain controversial, as their aesthetic merit is inseparable from their propagandizing of Nazi ideals. 449.